Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back in my YouTube channel Beyond the Text. Today I am going to make a brief discussion on postmodernism. Postmodernism, there are many isms in literature, but postmodernism basically 1910 to 1930. It is totally different from all isms. So let us make a glance about its background and its specific character. As with as with structuralism and post-structuralism, there is a great deal of debate about how exactly modernism and postmodernism differ. The two concepts are of different vintage, modernism being a long-standing category which is of crucial importance in the understanding of 20th century culture, whereas the term postmodernism, as is well known, has only become current since the 1980s. Modernism is the name given to the movement which dominated the art and culture of the first half of the 20th century. Modernism was that earthquake in the arts which brought down much of the structure of pre-20th century practice in music, painting, literature and architecture. One of the major epicenter of this earthquake seems to have been Vienna. During the period of 1819 to 1910, but the effects were felt in France, Germany, Italy, and eventually even in Britain. In art movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Futurism, its aftershock are still being felt today, and many of the structures it toppled have never been rebuilt. Without an understanding of modernism, then it is impossible to understand 20th century culture. So, if you want to understand the 20th century culture, you have to understand modernism and postmodernism. Without knowledge of these things, you could not able to understand 20th century literature and arts, and even the culture and society, because this thing reflects in treaties. In all the art touched by modernism, what had been the most fundamental element of practice were challenged and rejected. Thus, melody and harmony were put aside in music, perspective and direct pictorial representation were abandoned in painting, in favor of degree of abstraction in architecture, traditional form and material like pitched roofs, domes and columns, woods, stones and bricks were rejected in all favor of plain geometrical forms, often executed in new material like plate glass and concrete. In literature, finally, there was a rejection of traditional realism, chronological plots, continuous narratives, relayed by omniscient narrators, close ending, etc., in favor of experimental form of various kinds. The period of high modernism was the 20 years from 1910 AD to 1930, and some of the literary high priests of the movement writing in English were T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, Van Dan Lewis, Virginia Woolf, Wallace Stevens, and Gertrude Stein, and writing in French and German, Marcel Proust, Stephen Mallarmé, Henri Gide, Franz Kafka, and René Magritte. some of the important characters of the literary modernism practiced by these writers, including the following: a new emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity, that is, on how we see rather than what we see; a preoccupation evident in the use of stream of consciousness technique; a moment in novels away from the apparent objectivity provided by such features as omniscient external narration, fixed narrative points of view, and clear cut moral position; a blurring of distinction between genres so that novels tend to become more lyrical and poetic, for instance, and poems more documentary and prose like; a new linking of fragmented forms, discontinuous narrative, and random seeming collages of disparate materials; a tendency towards reflexivity so that poems, plays, and novels raise issues concerning their own nature, status, and role. The overall result of these shifts is to produce a literature which seems dedicated to experimentation and innovation. After its high point, modernism seemed to retreat considerably in the 1930s, partially, no doubt, because of the tension generated in decades of political and economic crisis, but a resurgence took place in 1960s, a decade which has interesting points of similar with the 1920s, when modernism was its height. However, modernism never regained the preeminence it had enjoyed in the earlier period. This gives us a rough indication of what and when modernism was. Does postmodernism then continue it or oppose it? To decide this, we need to attempt a working definition of this second term. As a starting point, we can take a selection of the most readily available description of postmodernism. J. A. Cudden's entry in his Dictionary of Literary Term and Literary Theory describes postmodernism as characterized by an eclectic approach, by liking for aleatory writing, parody, and pastiche. So far, this does not really put much daylight between modernism and postmodernism. Since the word eclectic suggests the use of the fragmented form, which, as we have just said, are characteristics of modernism. Eliot's The Waste Land, for instance, is a collage of juxtaposed, incomplete stories, or fragmentation of stories. Also, aleatory form, meaning those which incorporate an element of randomness or chance, were important of the Dadaist of 1917, who, for instance, made poems from sentences plucked randomly from newspaper. The use of parody and pastiches finally is clearly related to the abandonment of the divine presentation of authorship, implicit and the omniscient narratorial stance, and this too was a vital element in modernism. It could be said then that one way of establishing the distinction between modernism and postmodernism is to dissolve the sequence link between them by retrospectively redefining certain aspects of modernism as postmodernism. According to this view, they are not two successive stages in the history of arts, but two opposed moods or attitude differing as suggested in the next paragraph. It was a short brief of modernism and postmodernism. Thank you very much.